Now we are going to discuss these structures and how their properties seem to match the prediction made for certain other structures, subsystems, in the theoretical learning system architecture. Remember, this is the list of detailed predictions, and we've covered 3 of the major areas so far. So next, we'll go on to the evidence for some major compromises between behavioral effectiveness and resource needs in the brain. And these will show up in the properties of the amygdala, the hypothalamus, and the neurotransmitter distribution nuclei. Now, in general, one receptive field recommends many different types of behavior. And the reason is that the receptive fields most appropriate for recommending one type of behavior could have some similarities with those appropriate for recommending other types. And to economize on resources, these similarities must be exploited. But this resource sharing means that receptive fields sometimes have to be a compromise between the fields most effective for one type of behavior and those most effective for another type. And at other times, the behavioral benefit of having some separate fields for different types of behavior will outweigh the resource costs. And this situation is most likely to occur for general types of behavior critical to the brain. And that kind of separation makes another behavioral advantage possible. Some receptive fields could then put a priority on one particular general type of behavior by reducing the thresholds for detections of receptive fields that mainly recommend that type. Some major general types of behavior might be aggressive behaviors when self or possessions are threatened, escape behaviors when the threat is too great, rejection behaviors, for example, if a decaying object could result in disease, or even avoidance of most behaviors altogether if there's been a drastic change in the social environment, for example, and learning is needed to accommodate to the changed situation. And we do see priorities being placed on these and other types of behaviors. We label these priorities emotions. The angry emotion, when we're more likely to implement aggressive behaviors, or the sad emotion, when, because of some loss, often social, we tend to avoid social behaviors. Both the hypothalamus and the amygdala appear to be involved in this general prioritization process, although the hypothalamus is also involved in regulation of homeostasis in the body, keeping body temperature, food, water levels within favorable ranges, for example. The two structures are heavily interconnected, and both target the cortex, although the amygdala has more focused targets, and the hypothalamus targets more diffusely. So both manage relative behavioral priorities, but the hypothalamus in more general terms than the amygdala. In other words, the hypothalamus uses more information derived from body state, while the amygdala uses more complex situational considerations. So let's have a look at the information model for regulation of behavioral priorities by the hypothalamus and amygdala. One part of the amygdala is somewhat like the cortex. It gets inputs from the frontal cortex, the sensory cortices, and also from the hypothalamus. And all these inputs can be regarded as receptive field detections. In the case of the hypothalamus, a lot of the detections are within the state of the body, and they have a substantial degree of genetically specified definition. The cortex-like amygdala then detects more complex receptive fields that are combinations of these inputs, and those detections can be viewed as recommendations in favor of different general types of behavior. These recommendations are released to the striatum, going to the more ventral striatum or nucleus accumbens, where more strategic selections are made. Behavioral selections are then released to the thalamus in the usual way. But in this case, the thalamus releases selected receptive field detections by the amygdala. And those outputs from the amygdala go to the frontal cortex. And these releases implement biases on the selected behavior type by targeting cortical neurons that recommend behaviors of that type, and therefore reducing the threshold for receptive field detections within current inputs, and increasing the probability that a behavior of that type will be strongly recommended. The striatal-like amygdala again gets inputs from the frontal cortex and sensory cortices, but also from the cortex-like amygdala, and also from the hippocampus and the hypothalamus. All these inputs can be regarded as recommendations in favor of different general types of behavior. But in this case, the primary implementation route is through the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus targets the frontal cortex, but in this case affects the thresholds of cortical neurons over wider areas. And furthermore, the hypothalamus uses many different neurotransmitters and can therefore have finely discriminated effects on the cortex. And the hypothalamus can also act on the cortex on the basis of its own sensory inputs without guidance from the amygdala, and this is probably an older route in evolutionary terms. So once again, the amygdala targets very specific domains in the cortex, while the hypothalamus targets more broadly and uses many different neurotransmitters. Another example of broad versus specific targeting can be seen in the role of the two structures in memory. If, during an experience, priority is placed on one type of behavior, then information derived from the experience is quite likely to be relevant for guiding behaviors of the same type in similar experiences in the future. Hence, the relative priority placed on different types of behavior should influence the relative degree of cortical receptive field expansion in different cortical regions. In addition, if a very high priority is placed on just one behavior type, then it's important to record information about the circumstances in which such a high priority was assigned. So there should be more expansions in receptive fields of a complexity able to discriminate between complex situations. And as expected from these considerations, the mammillary bodies in the hypothalamus play a general role in selecting where receptive field expansions occur, while the amygdala plays a specific role of enhancing the memory of the circumstances in which very strong emotions were present.